way?
Well, let's see. Ah, there it is. Boston, Massachusetts Colony, 1763.
Gosh, Mr. Beanbody, I thought we were going back to 1776. But let's see. Oh yes, 13 years earlier.
Well, Lily, to really understand why there was a Revolutionary War, we have to return to the end of another conflict, the French and Indian War. The British were victorious in 1763, and the American colonists, who were British citizens, of course, were enormously proud of the mother country.
There can be no dispute now, gentlemen. Great Britain is the most powerful nation in the world.
And I, for one, take great pride in being a citizen of such an illustrious nation.
Hear, hear, to the mother country! Huzzah! Huzzah!
Gee, Mr. Beanbody, it sure doesn't look like those colonists are ready to start a revolution.
You're quite right, Jeffrey. But a chain of events changed many colonists' opinion of the mother country. And it changed it for the worse. We need to go to Great Britain to see how those events unfolded. We'll begin here, in Parliament, where laws were made for British citizens, wherever they might be, including North America. That's the King's Prime Minister, Lord George Grenville.
Gentlemen, our taxes on windows here in England have not proved to be sufficient. Thus, we're in desperate need of funds to pay our war debts.
To pay for soldiers' salaries, guns, ammunition, ships, and so on. Things needed in the French and Indian War.
So we must also impose taxes on the American colonists.
If I may speak, Prime Minister.
The chair recognizes Sir Thomas Carter.
I am in complete agreement. After all, His Majesty's army safeguards our American subjects from the French, Spanish, and Indians. I say it's only fair that the colonists pay for their own protection.
I concur. And any colonist accused of smuggling in America must, at his own expense, travel to the Vice Admiralty Court in Nova Scotia, where he'll be tried by a judge.
By a judge, not a jury? Huh. Well, let's go back to the Green Dragon Inn and Tavern a year later to see what the colonists thought of those two laws.
Outrageous!
A trial by judge only? That's appalling!
A trial by jury is the right of every British citizen. They can't take that away. Why, it's simply scandalous.
And what about these new import taxes, made without our consent, I might add? That's taxation without representation.
Gentlemen, please, let's not forget we are English citizens. If we feel the laws are unjust, we should complain and petition Parliament to reconsider.
The complaints were made, but they were ignored. Parliament simply did not understand how the colonists felt, which is somewhat understandable when you consider that the mother country was more than 3,000 miles away, a huge distance in the 1700s. Also, the communication was very slow and difficult, not at all like today. Nor did members of Parliament understand that the colonists were used to governing themselves. Each colony had its own legislature, and for the most part, the English government had left the colonies alone to manage their own affairs for more than 150 years. Now, all of a sudden, the British seemed to be interfering in the colonies' business. In any event, the new taxes did little to reduce Great Britain's war debts. So Parliament announced more taxes and regulations on the colonies, despite colonial objections. One was the Stamp Act tax. It required that only special, very expensive stamped paper could be used for many kinds of documents. Newspapers, contracts, pamphlets, magazines, and more. And now let's go to October 1765. A group of concerned citizens met in New York City. The meeting was called the Stamp Act Congress. The assembly decided that, among other actions, the colonists should no longer buy British goods. In other words, they wanted a boycott, to retaliate and to show that it was in charge. Parliament then passed the Declaratory Act, which stated that it would have all legal control over the colonies. And not only that, the so-called Townshend Acts dissolved the Massachusetts legislature and threatened to close down others. On top of that, even more taxes were passed. Moreover, the British military leader in New York, General Thomas Gage, was ordered to prepare his troops to enter Boston in case there was any trouble. And trouble there was. So the soldiers marched into Boston in 1768. As you can imagine, the colonists were very upset about that.
With soldiers here to keep us in line, it's as clear as the nose on my face. We are becoming a suppressed people.
And listen to this. Parliament proposes that colonial protesters be tried for treason. By law! All we want is some representation. That's not treasonous. That's our right as British citizens.
At that point, things went from bad to worse. Let's move on to March 5th, 1770, the date of the so-called Boston Massacre. There were a series of street fights in Boston that day between angry colonists and soldiers. They continued into the evening.
You big bully lobster! Why don't you go back to England where you belong?
What happened?
That simple-minded brute struck me!
What's that? A fire?
There's no fire, but that goon of a soldier over there beat up this defenseless patriot.
He did, eh? Well, we'll have to teach that red-coated thug a thing or two about proper manners. Follow me!
Halt, disperse, and no one will be hurt.
Go ahead and shoot. Shoot if you're brave enough.
Shoot us, you lobster-back weaklings.
You craven mice.
Don't shoot!
5 colonists' lives gone.
It is tragic, but surely the soldiers were afraid the mob would attack them.
Well, you're a loyalist, Malcolm, so naturally you'd see it that way.
Have you heard about the resounding success of the boycott, Malcolm?
I have. Indeed, Peg and I no longer buy any British-made clothing nor drink any tea. I'll not spend a tinker's pence on tea imported from England.
Speaking of tea, now let's move on to late November, 1773, when posters went up in various places around Boston announcing the arrival of tea-bearing ships. On December 16th, several groups of colonists, many disguised as Indians, boarded the vessels, carried all the tea chests up to the top deck, chopped them open with their tomahawks, and dumped their contents into Boston Harbor to protest Britain's tax policies on tea. This incident became known as the Boston Tea Party.
Gosh, Mr. Beanbody, I don't understand why the colonists were so upset about tea.
Right. Tea's just so boring.
It wasn't boring to the colonists, Lily. Tea was a very important drink at social gatherings, and was also an essential everyday beverage. Remember, in those days, there weren't all the sodas and health drinks available to us today. Thus, tea was one of the few flavored liquids to be had. So, how do you think Parliament reacted to the Boston Tea Party?
They were upset, right?
Well, let's see, shall we?
These colonists have shown themselves to be scandalously disloyal to the Crown. They are treacherous, wretched villains who need to be taught a lesson, which these 4 laws will do. They will show those hooligans that we will no longer tolerate their brazen impudence.
Those laws became known as the Intolerable Acts, or the Coercive Acts. The first closed the port of Boston until the shippers were paid for the destroyed tea. The second allowed British soldiers to live in colonist houses without having to ask. The next act said that colonial governors, appointed by the king, would have vastly increased powers. The final Intolerable Act allowed British soldiers to change judges if they felt they wouldn't get a fair trial.
Wow, I can just imagine how upset the colonists were when they heard about those intolerable acts.
Yes, Lily, they were quite upset. So in September 1774, 55 men gathered in Philadelphia for the First Continental Congress. They proclaimed the Intolerable Acts to be unlawful and said that Massachusetts should create a new legislature. They advised people to arm themselves in case of a British attack. Finally, they declared that if at any point a patriot was jailed, colonists had the right to jail British officials. And, oh my goodness, look at the time. We'd better get back for the parade.
Gee, Mr. Beanbody, I didn't know there were so many things that led up to the revolution.
Oh yes, Jeffrey, there certainly were. Starting from the need to pay for the French and Indian War, to each side becoming more angry and distrustful, many events made a revolution more and more likely.
Then what about the revolution itself, Mr. Beanbody?
Oh, no time for that now, Lily. The parade is about to begin. After the parade, we'll talk about the revolution and George Washington, the commander-in-chief of the American forces.
The British began to tax the colonists more heavily after the A. Revolutionary War, B. War of 1812, C. French and Indian War. The British Parliament felt that taxes on the colonists were justified because true or false? The British never let the colonies manage their own affairs. The Stamp Act taxed A. Stamps, B. Paper for contracts and magazines, C. All imported goods except tea. True or false? The Boston Tea Party was held for only British officials. The Boston Massacre killed A. 6 Native Americans, B. 7 British soldiers, C. 5 colonists. An important everyday drink in the colonies was another name for the coercive acts was the A. Intolerable Acts, B. Justifiable Acts, C. Disreputable Acts. True or false? One coercive act allowed British soldiers to live in colonists' houses without asking permission.